I'd like to talk to you about a topic that's not too popular with people these days, and that's the topic of obedience. And, I've talked to a lot of Christians and really specifically Catholics too about this because so many don't want to obey. And we take this and we apply it to our secular world. And we're like, I'm not going to obey someone unless, I want to. And I get that, right? And I remember talking to my daughter about how obedient her son was. And she said, I don't really know if I'd get into that obedience. I just want them to challenge authority. Sometimes you shouldn't obey. And that struck me because I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and obedience was very, very important. As a matter of fact, it was part of the Girl Scout promise that I made, when I stood there and made my little thing. And respecting authority was also part of that Girl Scout promise. And I realized it was a whole cultural thing. So I look at what does God say about obedience? Because there's so many things that we want to do, and yet God will often tell us to do them out of obedience above other things. For instance, with St. Faustina, when she was hearing things from her spiritual director, even things that she felt were not exactly right, when the Lord spoke with her, he said, you do what your spiritual director tells you to do. You be obedient to him. And so she said, all right, I am going to be obedient to God by being obedient to my spiritual director. Because in that, if she was ever told to do anything that she shouldn't do, then her spiritual director was the one that had to make that decision. Now, this topic is kind of tough too, because when do we obey? When do we disobey? Now, I know we still have to discern, if the thing we are told to obey is of God or not. For instance, many of the Nazis, I mean, in our generation, we refer to them often. They said, I did what I was ordered to do. I was being obedient to authority. But see, in that example, when what you were being commanded to do goes against God's laws, then you have a requirement not to obey. But it's in these things that don't necessarily go against God, but against what we think is right and wrong. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is a lot of our canceled priests. We have priests who are told, you are not allowed to say masses publicly anymore. And the priest has the option, well, he doesn't if he has taken a vow of obedience to his superiors to obey what they say, no matter how painful that is. Now, in the Bible, there are several spots, and I didn't mark them down right now, but that talk about vows. And I think of one specifically in Proverbs that I used to talk about in my financial classes that said it is better to not vow than to vow and not repay. Other areas of the Bible that talks about don't make a vow. But when you make a vow, you must fulfill that vow. So this example of our priests, when you've made a vow of obedience to your superiors, again, unless it goes against God, they tell you to break one of the commandments. They tell you to go against the deadly sins, for instance, or the virtues and become a deadly sin. You don't obey. But when we're talking about, okay, you're not allowed to say public masses, for instance, I am not saying that's not a tough call, because I've talked to many priests in that position. So that's just an example to put aside. Now we talk about, for instance, us wives. You guys know my topics are controversial for this day and age because I myself have struggled with this area of obeying my husband. But if God makes him my authority, puts him above me, and there's some decisions he's made that in the past I'm like, that's not what I would do. And when my marriage was bad, it's funny how it corresponded to I also wasn't obeying my husband. I was doing what I wanted to do. Even when he made a bad decision, the Lord said, it is not for you to decide, Christine. It's just for you to obey. Oh, I hear all the feminists and all the liberals hit me right now. But when, again, been married 40 years, I'm still a type A, alpha female, high powered, go. And when I started giving my husband the the helm, as he has always had from God anyway, when I started saying, you know what, I want to do this, but if you tell me we need to do that, I'm going to do it. Because just giving my husband that due respect again and me obeying actually makes them more culpable. I know for sure if we put things back in order, my husband's been like, now I better make a good decision because my wife is submitting to me. So this isn't specifically about husbands and wives. I am yet coming back to the idea of obedience. And God, I think, tests us through obedience. Do you obey those who I, the Lord your God, have put in authority over you or not? Because sometimes I think that's when we tend to make ourselves our own God. You think God doesn't know that my husband's going to make some bad decisions? What he says, Christine, obey him as the authority figure above you. Doesn't mean that I have to be stupid or dumb myself down. But when he speaks about authority, he put that system in place for a reason. So I looked up what God says about obedience, and a couple of the things. 2 John 1, verse 6. And this is love, that we walk in obedience to his commandments. Obedience to them. As you have heard from the beginning, his command is that you walk in love. So I'm commanded to do that. Do I have the freedom to say, I ain't doing it? I do have the freedom because God is a good God, gave me the freedom. But there will be consequences. It said in John 14:15, if you love me, you're going to obey what I command. So if God commanded us women to let our husbands be our authority, again, even if they make bad decisions, because you make bad decisions, how arrogant are we if we think, well, all my decisions are good and I'm not going to listen to his unless I want to. I tell you, people, we're taking a risk on that. And gentlemen that are watching, you have authority figures as well. Right. You definitely have God. And when God says you better love your spouse as you love your own body, you better put their well-being above the well-being of yourself. You better be obedient because that's what love is. Another one, when you choose to obey the Lord, he will bless you. When you obey the Lord, he will bless you. I just did a podcast with a beautiful soul, and she said to me something that her husband says. So she is an author of a book, and she was scared. What if this book doesn't sell? What if it's not good? What if this? What if that? What if? And her husband said to her, your job is to obey. And if the Holy Spirit placed on your heart that you need to write this book, then you obey it. The outcome is not yours. You give God the fiat, yes, Lord. And if that book fails, then you're giving God the yes to the potential for failure. God knew it would fail. He wants to see your yes. So even if her book sells nothing, that's not relevant to God. What's relevant to God is, I commanded you to write it. I've got better reasons. You may not know what they are. So what about you? Are you obedient to God when you think something will fail? Or are you only obedient to God when you think it's going to be successful? Are you obedient to God when he says, don't contracept, don't use in vitro? Well, I might not have kids then, God. You just obey me. You give me the consequences. Are you obedient to God when he tells you, oh goodness, lots of examples are coming to my head. I mean, the easy ones, don't have sex outside of marriage. Do you obey that? Or do you think, but this is my fiance. We're going to be married anyway. Or are are you disobedient to that? Do you obey God with whatever he tells you to do? Whatever he tells you to do. If God told you to quit a job or start a job, doesn't make sense. Why would you want me to start a job, Lord? I'm a wife. I'm a this. Wow. I'd like for you to look up obedience in the Bible, and I'd like you to meditate on it. It is one of the most powerful requests of the Lord of us. I'd like you to study, why is obedience so important? And dare I say, because God is testing us, not in you make all the perfect decisions, in submitting. Jesus submitted his whole life. He submitted his flesh. He submitted his blood. He gave away his physical flesh as it was ripped off of his body by whips and chains. He submitted his blood as every drop was drained out of him. He submitted his omnipotence when he allowed himself to be put into the womb. He trapped himself into the womb of someone he himself created out of obedience to the Father. He knew that they wouldn't make perfect decisions. He even made the mother of God, his own mother, submit, be obedient to Joseph, who was imperfect, who was a sinner. So don't be arrogant. Don't think, well, I know better. You may. You may even know the exact answer. But if the person you're supposed to obey, as commanded by God, tells you to do something different, then you say, Lord, I'm going to put this in your hands. I don't know why my priest is telling me to do this, or my spouse is telling me to do that. But I'm going to trust you, Lord. My examples may not be the best, but remember, you give your fiat to God, obey him, and leave the outcomes to him. Even if the outcome looks like it's a worldly failure, God will use that. Oh, he will. I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'm Dr. Christine Bacon, and you've been watching another Bacon Bit. And I always want to remind you, no matter how dark the days get, no matter what you see around you, please live your life sunny side up. And maybe that's S-O-N, sunny side up, because he is.